Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for January 29th, 2021. Hope you're doing well. So this is a big day in our journey through the Bible as we go through the text of Scripture this year. We're starting two new books on the same day. So we're starting the book of Mark and the book of Romans, two of my favorite books in the New Testament. And we're also continuing on through the book of Esther and the book of Genesis. So we're in Genesis 30, Esther 6, Mark 1, and Romans 1. For Mark and Romans, I want to take some time just to give you a brief overview of each of those books, as brief as I can be, so we don't get too long here. But I do want you to have kind of an overview of them as you start to read through them. So I want to spend a little bit less time on Esther and Genesis. For Genesis, by the way, basically what you have is the naming of some of Jacob's sons, which of course is significant. As I mentioned last time, this is the development of the nation of Israel, really. And names in the ancient Near East were very significant. They could tell much about the person's character, as in the case of Jacob himself. They could even be prophetic at times of the person's life. And then at the end of that story, we have, of course, Jacob doing a little swindling of Laban himself, and yet God blesses even in that situation. It's God is sometimes blesses folks despite themselves. And of course, God has a plan that's larger than even Jacob himself. It's through Jacob and his family that he will bring forth that blessing to the nations. And so that's what we see at the end of the book or end of that chapter. And then in Esther, we have the story kind of getting intense here because of course we have, if you remember at the very beginning of our discussion of Esther, we had those just so happens moments. Well, we've had the first banquet where Esther has now requested another banquet. And in between those, it just so happened that the king could not sleep. And what happens when you can't sleep? Well, you grab a history book. And it just so happens that he takes the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia and reads about Mordecai and what he had done to, if you remember that one event earlier on in the book of Esther, where Mordecai had discovered this plot against the king, and it was written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia. And so Mordecai spared the life of the king, and the king calls in Haman, his chief of staff and second in command, and asks him what's to be done to honor the one who has honored the king. And Haman just so happened to be, by the way, standing outside the king's room when this happened. So he was able to be called in, and it just so happens that Haman thinks that the king is talking about him, and so he gives this long list of things that should be done to honor the king or the king's trusted servant, and the king says, "Okay, go do that for Mordecai." So quite the plot twists here in the story, and so and that brings us to Mark and to Romans. So let's talk about Mark first. So Mark, of course, was a formerly anonymous, but most it's attributed to John Mark, and I think that's a credible tradition. It's probably, and by the way, that tradition goes back a long way. Probably, and of course, John Mark was the closest to Peter, and so most scholars believe that Peter had an influence on Mark in his writing. It's a gospel of that's written to the Gentiles. So unlike Matthew, which was a gospel by a Jewish Christian written to Jewish Christians, Mark is being written to Gentiles. And so you'll see him explaining some customs, even translating some of the Aramaic, including some what we might call Latinisms in the text. And what I love about Mark is a couple of things. It's really fast moving. And so one of the things you'll notice is the repetition of the word euthys in the Greek, which means translated immediately. So things immediately happen, immediately. And it's moving fast. And it's moving fast for a reason. It's getting to, of course, the crucifixion and resurrection. That's what Mark is heading to. So some people have called Mark a passion narrative with an introduction because he really is focused in on what Jesus accomplished on the cross and his resurrection. And so he's heading straight to that. The other thing I would say that it is a gospel that's really focused on one thing. And you see that in our text today. So if you pay attention to Mark 1:1, it says this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and so this is what Mark is all about. In fact, it's about identifying who Jesus is. What the irony of it is that there's this misunderstanding motif in the Gospel of Mark, that everybody in the Gospel of Mark gets it wrong, except for the reader who knows from the very beginning who Jesus is, and of course Jesus himself. And so there's this journey throughout the Gospel of Mark to figure out who Jesus is, and Jesus, by his miracles and sometimes by his words, is establishing his identity to his audience and to the reader as well. And so we are constantly Mark is constantly asking the question through the mouth of the characters, who then is this Jesus? And the answer is that he's the Son of God, right? And Peter finally gets that right at the end, but he's the Son of God who, of course, will lay down his life for his people, which Peter ultimately accepts. But when Jesus tells him that, he does not. So, yeah, Mark is a great. It's also kind of I would describe as a frank gospel. It's displays the disciples' faults and shows their humanity. So lots of things that we can point to with Mark and pay attention to, but really pay attention to how Jesus is revealed and what he's revealed to be, because he's still the same yesterday, today, and forever, isn't he? That brings us to Romans. So Romans obviously is the longest of Paul's letters. It is, which explains its placement in the canon, by the way, at the head of Paul's letters, as we begin our discussion of Paul's letters and our reading through of Paul's letters in RTB 2021. It's probably the most influential in terms of its impact on church history and on theology. People like, for instance, Martin Luther, heavily influenced by Paul's theology. Well-known preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones, who I've quoted before from the pulpit, preached on a sermon series for 13 years on the book of Romans. So it's a lot of content here. But of course, this is the most complete, I would say, exposition of Paul's theology that we find in the scriptures. And yet it's still theology in the context of addressing specific issues within the church. Specifically, Paul, I think, is writing probably around the late 50s, somewhere around in there, perhaps while he was in Greece on his third missionary journey. He's trying to reconcile Jews and Jews and Gentiles in Rome, so they'll support his Spanish mission. He talks about this at the end of his letter. And so to accomplish this, Paul has to explain in detail his theology, and especially those parts that were difficult for the Jews and the Gentiles. What we find in our text today, the introduction, is perhaps the longest introduction of any letter. It's probably because he had never visited this church. And we see some of the themes that are very prominent throughout the rest of the book of Romans that appear in this letter. For instance, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. He appeals to his apostolic. Paul appeals to his apostolic authority, that he has authority to proclaim the gospel as one who has been designated an apostle by Jesus himself. Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. The gospel going to the Gentiles, the Jew first and then to the Gentiles, the power of God into salvation for both, and Paul's mission for the glory of God. And so this is Paul's introduction to the gospel. And when we get so the introduction is through verse 17. When we get to verse 18, Paul, throughout the rest of the chapter, starts to talk about God's righteous wrath against sinners, but specifically against Gentiles. And he speaks of how there is no excuse for even those who do not have the gospel message, which is one of the reasons why we need to go and proclaim the gospel. There's no excuse because God's attributes, invisible attributes, has been revealed to everyone, and we can know something about God through what we would call general revelation, through creation, through what we know in the created order, and therefore we are without excuse. But we still need the gospel, don't we? And that's what Paul says later on in his book, where he talks about how we need somebody to preach to us. How will they hear unless they have a preacher? So we need those missionaries still to go forth. Brief introduction there to Paul's letter to the book of Romans, if Paul's letter to the Romans in the book of Romans. If you have questions, by the way, really anything that we're discussing in these videos, feel free to drop us a note, or even on the Facebook page, drop us a comment, and love to interact with you there and answer any questions you might have. But I hope this has been a nice little study, and I hope you'll enjoy these this reading through Mark and Romans in these coming days and weeks on this day, January 29th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.